So we left off the other video with the owl-eyed man and Gatsby at Gatsby's funeral. He's the only guest that shows up besides Nick and Gatsby's father. He has a really interesting comment. Nick hadn't seen him since the party at Gatsby's house where he was remarking that the books were actually real and he was incredibly drunk. He says, "I couldn't get to the house. Neither could anybody else." That's a tongue-in-cheek comment. Go on. They used to go there by the hundreds. He took off his glasses. He wiped them again on the outside. Poor guy, he said. And that's it. Why would he, of all characters, show up? We're going to look at that in just a moment once we're done with the plot. So Nick begins to talk about his growing up and his youth and his memories where status seemed everything. And he talked about Christmas and he talked about the dim lights of like the parties that they used to go to, the friends, the acquaintances, the matching, the invitations. Oh, are you going to Ordway's, the Heresies, the Schultzes, and the long green tickets that clasped tight in our gloved hands. That's my Midwest. Not the wheat or the prairies or the lost Swede towns, but the thrilling returning trains of my youth and the street lamps and the sleigh bells. I'm part of that. A little solemn with the feelings of long winters, the complacent from growing up in the Caraway house in a city where dwellings are still called through decades by a family's name. I now see that this has been a story of the West after all. Tom and Gatsby, Daisy and Jordan and I were all Westerners, and maybe we possessed some deficiency in common, which made us unadaptable to Eastern life. Even when the East excited me most, even when I was keenly aware of its superiority, in the broad or bored, sprawling, swollen towns beyond the Ohio, with their inquisitions that spared only the children and the very old, West Egg especially figures into my more fantastic dreams. It's 100 houses, at once conventional and grotesque. They're sullen. In the foreground, there are solemn men dressed in suits walking along the sidewalk. The men turn at the house. A wrong house, but no one knows the woman's name and no one cares. After Gatsby's death, the East was haunted for me like that, distorted beyond my eyes' power of correction. So when the blue smoke of brittle leaves was in the air, and the wind blew the wet laundry stiff on the line, I decided to come back home. And so Nick is kind of reminiscent about the Midwest and how it was more oriented toward family and a sense of pride in old money, in the railroads, in the hard work. It was more akin to the bootstraps narrative. And if you remember back, like where we started this year, talking about westward growth and westward expansion, with the frontier literature, one of the themes was that you could become a self-made man. That one of the American ideals from the very beginning is that we came to this land without status. And status is something that a person could gain or grow by obtaining commodities, obtaining land. It was a mentality of equality. And yet in the East, there was sort of that remnant of the class system, of the caste system that they couldn't escape. And that's what Nick is saying. I don't associate with that America. It's sort of a nostalgia for what happened in the past. So Nick wanted to take care of one more thing. He goes in to talk to Jordan. And she says, she's upset at him, basically like, you stood me up. You threw me over on the telephone. I don't give a care about you now. But it was a new experience for me, and I felt a little dizzy for a while. We shook hands. Do you remember a conversation we had once about driving a car? Not exactly. You said a bad driver was only safe until she met another bad driver? Well, I met another bad driver, didn't I? It was careless of me to make such a wrong guess. I thought you were rather an honest, straightforward person. I thought that was your secret pride. I'm 30, I said. I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it honor. She didn't answer. Angry and half in love with her and tremendously sorry, I turned away. What was that exchange about? What did he reveal to Jordan? If you go back and you look more specifically, I want you to kind of probe and try to understand what's going on here. In other words, there's a disagreement because they're both too strong-willed and they have a mutual disrespect for one another and each other's way of life. And so Nick is basically calling her out and saying, you are disingenuous and I don't respect you. Then he saw Tom Buchanan. He was walking ahead of me on Fifth Avenue, his hands out from his body, aggressively. Just as I slowed up to avoid overtaking him, he stopped, and he was frowning into the windows of a jewelry store, and suddenly he saw me. What's the matter, Nick? Do you object to shaking hands with me? Yes. You know what I think of you. You're crazy. I don't know what's the matter with you. Tom, what did you say to Wilson that afternoon? He stared at me without a word. I told him the truth. He came to the door while we were getting ready to leave, and when I sent down word that we weren't in, he tried to force his way upstairs. He was crazy enough to kill me if I hadn't told him who owned the car. His hand was on the revolver in his pocket every minute he was in the house. What if I did tell him? That fellow had it coming to him. He threw dust in your eyes just like he did in Daisy's, but he was a tough one. He ran over Myrtle like you'd run over a dog and never even stopped his car. There was nothing I could say, except the one unutterable fact that wasn't true. And if you think I didn't have my share of suffering, look here. When I went to give up that flat and saw that box of dog biscuits sitting there, I sat down and cried like a baby. It was awful. I couldn't forgive him, and I couldn't like him. They were just careless and confused people. Tom and Daisy, they smashed things up and creatures, and then they retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together. I shook hands with him. It seemed silly not to. Then he went into the store to buy a pearl necklace or perhaps a pair of cuff buttons. Gatsby's house was still empty when I left. No one ever went past the entrance of the gate without stopping for a minute and pointing inside. Maybe it was he who drove Daisy and Gatsby over to the East Egg the night of the accident. I didn't want to hear it, and I avoided him when I got off of the train. I spent Saturday nights in New York because of the gleaming and the dazzling parties of his were with me so vividly I could still hear music and laughter, and one night I did hear a car there, and I saw its lights, but I didn't investigate. It was a final guest who had been away over the ends of the earth and didn't know that the party was over. On the last night, with my trunk packed and my car sold, and on the steps of the world, on the white steps, an obscene word was scrawled by a boy, and then I wandered down to the beach, and I sprawled out on the sand. Mostly of the big shore places were closed now. As the moon rose higher and the houses began to melt away, I became aware of the old island here, and it flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes. And I wondered if that's the way it had been for Gatsby. Compelled into an aesthetic contemplation, as I sat there brooding on the old, unknown world, I thought of his wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have been so close he could hardly fail to grasp it. He didn't know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in the vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled into the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, and tomorrow we'll run faster and stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning we'll beat on, boat against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. So he ends with the final analogy of what it must have been like for the Dutch sailors who settled New York, and all the hopes and the dreams that they carried with them, only to be shattered by reality, danger, turmoil. That dreams, that American narrative, is always something that is an elusive dream state, that even for Tom and Daisy and those that have money and wealth and status, it's meaningless in the end. They don't have friends, they don't have love, they don't have trust, they don't have community. All they have is their wealth and more. Like, Tom ends going into the store to buy something else because that's what they retreat into when their life holds no meaning or purpose for them anymore. So those are kind of the plot elements of the final chapter. I want to talk about a few of the characters just briefly. So let's talk about Wolfsheim. He is your quintessential cook, mob boss. And in that, we learn that his story has been one of tragedy. He used to show up for friends' funerals, but then he realized I can't get mixed up in there anymore. So he's seen tragedy and suffering, loss of relationship, and loss of hope. We see that he no longer believes in the goodness of others. Hang on. Just finish this up. Okay, oh my goodness, I cannot type. Okay, so he's a cook and a mob boss. He has seen tragedy and suffering, loss of relationship, loss of hope, though he no longer believes in goodness. There is no fidelity, honor, or courage in him. In the end, it is simply self, is the God that he serves. Okay, additionally, we have the owl-eyed man. And he is symbolic of one who is authentic, because he's enamored with things that are true. So, he sees through the facade that is everyone else and everything else, which just goes to show that someone who is completely drunk for a month on end and out of his mind is more sane and more sober than your average human being. So let's do as a comparison. The people at the time were more inebriated with their own agendas than a man who had been drunk for a month. I'm not sure why this is like a text box is so Whoa, it's super weird on this. I apologize. I'm trying to move it. Okay. Well, there you go. Oh my. All right, so the next thing I wanted to indicate is that Nick, he begins to see things as they really are, and he's nostalgic for an America where the bootstraps narrative is alive. And where men are not exploited and victims to their own pursuit of success. And lastly, we have Gatsby. I think I kind of just want to reiterate what I said with Nick about Gatsby, that he was a victim of his own pursuit and success. And we have Tom and Daisy, and they are symbolic of superficiality, of wealth, prejudice, and the caste system. And in the end, they are miserable and frauds. And that completes our character chart.